Programming is supported by Flint Hills Resources, thanking healthcare and frontline professionals who continue to work through the COVID-19 pandemic, and also recognize organizations from around the state that are coming together to support Minnesotans during this challenging time.
I'm glad to see Omar Jimenez back on the air on CNN. Earlier this morning, around 5 o'clock this morning, he was doing a live shot at Lake Street and Minnehaha Avenue, and he was arrested live on the air. And his whole crew, camera person, the producer, went to jail. They were released. Omar is a person of color, and that arrest has really touched off a backlash on social media. Governor Walz has apologized for that. So I see Omar is back on the air doing live shots here this morning from Minneapolis. This is MPR News, 91.1, KNOW, Minneapolis, St. Paul. We're going to go off to Kerri Miller here in about 6 seconds. 56 degrees current temperature. High today should be around 68 degrees. Kerri Miller, what's on the show?
Hey, Kathy, we're going to continue a conversation that we started in yesterday's 9 a.m. hour. In the second half, we got into a discussion with our guests about what genuine, authentic police reform would look like and what it contains. Is it independent prosecutors when situations like this happen? Is it that kind of an entrenched culture recognition? And we're going to ask the questions about what it takes to upend that entrenched culture. We have guests on the show who have served for a long time in law enforcement. We have a guest on the show who has thought widely about this as a law professor. And I'm going to open the phone lines here, and I want to know about whether citizens of Minnesota and beyond are confident that our community leaders, our mayors, our police chiefs, and others can get this done. That's what we're talking about at 9 a.m.
Right now, the news.
Live from NPR News, I'm Corva Coleman. Protests and chaos continued for a third night in Minneapolis. Demonstrators set fire to a police precinct station, angry over the killing of George Floyd. The unarmed black man had been in the custody of Minneapolis police. NPR's John Stefani says smoke billowed through some of South Minneapolis.
There were several fires burning in South Minneapolis this morning in the vicinity of the 3rd Police Precinct, which was burned by protesters last night. More neighborhood businesses were burned overnight or damaged, including a well-known local bar. Law enforcement was actively working to clear the area this morning. Meanwhile, downtown was quiet with some minor damage, but construction workers were headed to their job sites.
NPR's John Stefani reporting. Twitter flagged one of President Trump's tweets about Minneapolis earlier today, saying it glorified violence. Trump's tweet read, quote, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." The tweet on the president's personal account was hidden. The White House then used its official government account to repeat Trump's tweet word for word. Twitter has now hidden that tweet from view. Stocks opened mostly lower this morning as the Commerce Department reported a steep drop in consumer spending last month. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell about 100 points in early trading.
With many restaurants and retail stores shuttered in April, consumer spending plunged more than 13%, the steepest drop since the government started keeping records more than 60 years ago. That's a huge break on the U.S. economy, which is largely driven by consumer spending. The Commerce Department says Americans cut back on purchases of both goods and services, from health care to haircuts. Meanwhile, personal income jumped more than 10% in April, as falling paychecks were outweighed by government relief payments. With fewer places to spend money, Americans bank part of the extra income. The personal savings rate jumped last month to 33%. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
A federal appeals court in San Francisco today will consider the government's request to retry Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy. NPR's Kirk Siegler reports the case against Bundy and his role in a 2014 armed standoff collapsed after a mistrial in 2017.
Federal prosecutors were widely criticized for bungling their case against Cliven Bundy, especially after failing to get convictions in a separate but related armed standoff led by his sons in Oregon. Conservative activist Larry Klayman is Bundy's attorney.
What's really ironic and frankly I think disgusting is that the Trump Justice Department is the one that allowed the U.S. attorney in Nevada to take the appeal.
The U.S. Attorney's Office declined to comment, but court filings show prosecutors will argue their missteps in the trial were inadvertent. Kirk Siegler, NPR News.
On Wall Street, the Dow was down about 112 points. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include ServPro, committed to observing the highest cleaning and sanitation standards. Available to help 24/7. ServProPrep.com/NPR. Franchises are independently owned and operated.
For NPR News in the Twin Cities, I'm John Wanamaker. As protests continued in Minneapolis and St. Paul, looters damaged more businesses overnight, and the Minneapolis 3rd Precinct station burned. Minneapolis City Council Vice President Andrea Jenkins says leaders want to give people the chance to peacefully protest the death of George Floyd, but she says the situation got rapidly out of hand and police lost control. Jenkins says she's worried the situation won't improve until Hennepin County Attorney Mike Freeman or others act on calls to arrest the officers involved in Floyd's death.
Until Mike Freeman or the BCA or the FBI or whoever makes some arrests in this case and charge these officers, I think it's going to be a very challenging road to move forward.
Freeman has asked for patience as authorities gather evidence in the Floyd case. In the next hour, Governor Tim Walz is expected to address the ongoing violence in the Twin Cities. We plan to carry his remarks live on the air and online. State health officials reported 35 more deaths yesterday from COVID-19. That's the highest daily increase since the pandemic reached Minnesota. Most of the deaths were people in their 70s and older, but State Health Commissioner Jan Malcolm says 7 people died who were in their 50s and 60s.
And 1 person in their early 40s and 1 in their early 30s. And at this point in time, there are no known underlying health conditions reported for the 2 individuals in their 30s and 40s.
The total number of people killed by COVID-19 in Minnesota has now reached 967. Malcolm says she anticipates a spike of cases in a couple of weeks due to the large protests over the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis and St. Paul. The Wisconsin State Fair has been canceled due to the coronavirus pandemic. The cancellation announced yesterday marks the first time since 1945 that the 169-year-old annual tradition will not take place. The Minnesota State Fair was canceled last week for the first time since 1946. Wisconsin State Fair Board Chairman John Yingling said safety of fairgoers weighed heavily in his decision to cancel. This is NPR News.
Good morning. I'm Kerri Miller. This is NPR News, and we're going to reopen a conversation that we didn't finish yesterday. Towards the end of the show, we began to talk about why the bad apple theory doesn't suffice for an incident like the one that ended in George Floyd's death. You can see why we would all want to believe that. One police officer who knelt on Mr. Floyd's neck and several of his colleagues on the scene who did not intervene, even as he said he couldn't breathe. Are they the exception or the rule? The Minneapolis police chief would probably tell us they're the exception. Listen to what Professor Seth Stoughton said about the barrel, not the individual apples.
Sometimes it's flaws with the barrel that the apples are in that make them go bad. And if we remember the phrase, it's not there are only a few bad apples, so we don't need to worry about it. It's a few bad apples spoils the bunch.
Here's what the attorney for the Floyd family wrote in an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday. Is this an outlier or is this endemic? It starts to feel like genocide. So a conversation again, because we've certainly done this before, about what it will take to change police culture at its very core. As our guests join us this morning, I really need to hear from you. Citizens and members of law enforcement, are you confident that mayors and police chiefs know the extent of the problem and know how to make the necessary changes inside police departments? I want to make it clear, we're not only talking about Minneapolis here. This happens throughout the country. So that's why there is a larger lens on this conversation this morning. Do you trust law enforcement agencies and city leaders in whatever community you're in to get this right? And I'd really like to have the perspective of citizens and any members of law enforcement who are listening this morning, retired, currently active, study criminal justice. Your view would be very important too. Here's the phone number, 651-227-6000. 800-242-2828, anywhere in the upper Midwest. And of course on Twitter, I'll get to as many of these as I can. It's at Kerri, Kerri, MPR. We're beginning this morning with Ronald Serpis. He's a former police chief in New Orleans. He's a professor of practice, criminology, and justice at Loyola University in New Orleans. And he's with us today from Louisiana. And Ron, welcome back to the show. I'm glad to have you this morning.
Good morning, Kerri. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about what is truly one of the most important things we face.
I first am really interested in your perception of these images that are coming out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I have to say, the despair and the hopelessness that I think we're seeing in these protests. What are you making of this?
I think what's painful is Mr. Floyd's death. We all are horribly pained. I mean, I can't wrap my head around in any way, shape, or fashion what that officer did. It's impossible. So putting that aside, what I do think a lot of commentators around the country, political, social scientists, and others, these types of destructions of other people's innocent property moves the focus away from Mr. Floyd. I'm sure that's not what they want, right? I'm sure people want us to maintain our focus on Mr. Floyd's death. But when the images of an AutoZone and a Wendy's and a Target and a low-income housing that are burned to the ground, they're going to hurt so many people, I just wanted to, like many folks, and say, look, that's not going to help. And then at some point, government has to reassert that there is control so that we can solve the problem. So yes, Mr. Floyd's death is horrific. But burning down innocent people's property is bad too.
I think what we hear from the people who are in the streets, not the people who are setting fire to the businesses, the people that really want to protest, is we have been here so many times before. In our community, in other communities, it does not change. They don't hear us.
I think that's true, but do you think those people would also say, I'm going to burn my neighbor's building? I don't think so.
No, because most people don't.
The protest is perfect. Exactly. The people who infiltrate the protest to create violence, that's a separate issue I think we could confront. You know, you said a few minutes ago, bad apples, bad barrel. There's a little bit of that here as well, right? You have people who are really trying to express their anger and disgust with the system, and then it's being potentially thwarted by other people's personal messages. But when you think about bad apples and bad barrels, you raise a really interesting issue. I was the police chief in New Orleans. I was the police chief in Nashville. I was the chief of the Washington State Police through the State Patrol. I think that the bad apple argument is a strong one, and professors like Andrew Papachristos, who's brilliant, is beginning to see more and more science. People in Australia and London are seeing more science to talk about bad apples. But you know what's hurting the barrel? What's hurting the barrel is the reliance on these collective bargaining agreements and 1900-era civil service rules that protect employment to the point that's not consistent with today's reality.
And when you say protect employment, you mean of the officers themselves in the face of this?
Absolutely, absolutely. You can't have an early warning system of identifying potential problem apples, which can affect a barrel, if the barrel stops the transmission of that person's behavior unless it was a founded disciplinary action. That's common in the country. So I think the argument isn't that there's one or the other. I think that the argument is that they're influencing one another, and the 480,000 cops that are not getting in trouble are stuck in the middle, and the millions of citizens are stuck in the middle. I'm not against union rights. I'm not against labor and management working together. What I am against is if you look at Laquan McDonald, if you look at the Tamir Rice, if you look at these cases throughout the country, you have prior discipline overturned by separate judges and arbiters absent facts. And that is disruptive to the barrel because the cop comes back into the workplace and the labor group says, oh, we beat him again, guys. And that's not the message we should be sending. The message should be sending is I made a mistake. I understand my mistake. I'm not going to make a mistake again. Not we beat him on a technicality at an arbitrator hearing and you got your time back. That is pervasive in the disciplinary system of the American policing function, and it's corrosive. Look at Chauvin's record.
Let me bring Cami Chavis in here. She's a former federal prosecutor, a professor of law, and director of the criminal justice program at Wake Forest University School of Law. Professor, welcome. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Cami, I wonder what you think of what Ron Serpas just said. I mean, we got right to brass tacks here pretty quickly. Is he right in identifying this corrosive influence of, I guess, impunity that is continued through some of these union agreements?
Yes, I think that unfortunately, unions, police unions, have played a really difficult role. It's made it really difficult to implement police reform. I heard the conversation about bad apples and bad barrels. I would love for when there is this type of brazen police misconduct for the union representatives to come out and say, either say nothing at all, but just don't try immediately to say there's nothing wrong here, because there's clearly something wrong, and those unions, I think, lose credibility when we're going to protect these officers at all costs.
Let me take some calls here. We have full phone lines. If you're getting a busy signal as you're calling in, please try us back. I'd like to hear from you again. Hearing from citizens this morning, members of law enforcement, retired in the criminal justice system. Your views are really welcome on the conversation this hour. To Walter in Crystal. Hi, Walter. Thanks so much for calling.
Good morning. Thank you for accepting the call. I agree with your speakers up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
The civil service system does offer an opportunity for people to get by with things that they wouldn't get by in a regular corporate or regular non-corporate job. But going back to is there hope? Will this change anything?
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe it will. For context, I'm 77 years old. I was part of the business that was the very last fire to be set in the Detroit riot in 1967. And we were burned down to the basement floor only because there was hairspray. We were a beauty and barber supply business, and there was hairspray that started exploding, and the fire department left because of the threat of snipers.
Wow.
Now, that riot started for exactly the same reason that this one started, as a direct response to police brutality against men and women that were being put in a paddy wagon. And the other people in the area that were witnessing it started attacking the police for attacking these people with billy clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, Detroit was in flames. I won't go into all the details, but just to let you know that it wasn't a race riot. It was in my opinion, just mass hysteria, because some of the places that were looted were in neighborhoods and areas of the city where, black people didn't go, couldn't shop. Just to give you an idea, the euphemism for the area was called the Avenue of Fashion. So it was for very wealthy people inside the city, not in the suburbs, and people looted there. But it wasn't as big, but it was all over the city in different spots. But where it was mainly concentrated was where it was. Now, the people from eyewitness, I stood in front of our business Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We opened for business Thursday. Friday morning, we were set on fire.
Oh, my gosh. Wow.
And hearsay has it that a police officer set us on fire. But that's neither here nor there. But
Walter,
still,
if I might, what I hear in the wealth of experience that you're bringing to this conversation is this is cyclical, and the things that were going on in Detroit in the late 60s bear more than a passing resemblance to what we're seeing here today in Minneapolis.
I've lived in the 40s. It was in the 40s, in the 50s, this in my lifetime. But if you look at history, it goes all the way back to the time in 1620 when the first Africans were brought here, and people wanted to pay them. The clergy said they had to be paid because they were people, and they finally declared them inhuman rather, not human, so they could be slaves. And then, of course, later, race was created in law, and with this direct action to demonize us and make us feel as though we were less than human, or make other people believe we were less than human.
Ron, can I ask you, I mean, Walter is, taking us through the arc of history on this. What also resonates for me is when he talks about the despair they felt in Detroit years ago. You see the same kind of quality of that despair today. What do we do with that?
I think we have to continue to use it as a reason to embrace dramatic change. City mayors and councils sign collective bargaining agreements that enshrine rights that are unfair to the community in the collective bargaining agreement. Civil service systems needed in the 1900s have to catch up with the 21st century. All officers and all employees deserve a right to defend themselves, but let me be clear. In the 14 years I was a police chief in 3 major organizations in this country, the center lane, you have extremes on either side, right? The center lane of problematic officers had been problematic officers their entire careers. And getting that through a disciplinary system, a judicial system, a civil service system that's looking for an I wasn't crossed or a T wasn't cut off. I'm not suggesting we accept poor police leadership. What I'm accepting is we have to quit substituting the judgment of police chiefs because of these archaic systems of employee protection. It's all over the country.
But
it's all over the country.
But Ron, in some ways, I feel like you are still focused on the bad apples and not the barrel there. Are you saying if we change these agreements, it would change the culture so significantly that even the potential bad apples would have to improve?
I think what it would tell us is the difference if there is an apple and create argument that's meaningful. I mean, when someone, like when Mr. Floyd's killed, it's not important to deal with anything other than he was killed. I do think that the bad crate and barrel is the structural institutions of how we deal with long-term disciplinary problems. And then the bad apples are not unique to policing. Every profession on earth has some group of people who are bad apples in their profession: lawyers, doctors, dentists, nurses. Police exercise a power that those people don't. You can pick your lawyer or your doctor. You don't get to pick your cop. So police officers have to be held to a higher standard than other professions. So I think we have enough information to deal with bad actors and then see how they're influencing the bad crate. But the debate's not as important as fixing the fundamental flaws that allow both of these to exist.
Okay. Cami Chavis, go ahead.
Yes, no, I mean, I agree with what's been said. There are organizational instances of organizational culture at issue here. What type of culture exists within a police department to allow an officer to remain on the force with a certain number of complaints? My understanding is that Derek Chauvin had 18 complaints. I would want to know, when are those? I know he's been on the force for a very long time, but that is, a high number of complaints. 2 of them he received a reprimand. I want to know more about that, but what we're seeing, I mean, even over the past few days, in terms of Officer Tao and the other officers, standing by idly while this happened. There are bad apples, but bad apples do not. They are not allowed to exist where the culture itself is not rotten, and the culture needs to. We need to have things in place to make sure that we can, and I heard Ron say this earlier, but have procedures in place to identify these problem officers. We know who they are. And the last thing that I would say about this is that we have the tools that we need to fix policing and police departments. We have the tools. We know what they are. We just need the will to do it.
I want to bring Ronald Johnson into the discussion, too. He is a former captain in the Missouri State Patrol. He led the law enforcement response in Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown was killed by a white police officer. He's now CEO of Lodestone Solutions Group, and he joins us this morning from St. Louis. And Ron Johnson, welcome to you. It's good to have you on the show.
Thank you, Kerri, for having me.
I know you've heard a bit of our references to bad apples and the barrel. This comes from a conversation that we talked about yesterday. We wanted to continue it. We also have taken note of something that the attorney for George Floyd's family, Benjamin Crump, has written in the Washington Post, which is this an outlier or is this endemic? It starts to feel like genocide. There's a lot of despair about the idea that culture inside law enforcement can actually change. And I'd love to have your view on that.
You know, and I believe culture can change, but I think the problem is in law enforcement and a lot of agencies, we don't have that real honest and truthful conversation. And I think we have to have conversations that hurt feelings, that bring out things that are deep within us. And I think we don't have those. I think we're still afraid to have those real conversations. I think in those real conversations also have to include those that we serve as a part of that training. So I think our training has to change. And when I get an opportunity to talk to law enforcement, I try to have that real conversation. A lot of times we bring up topics that are taboo to discuss.
Like what?
Well, we all have opinions of each other based on race. We try to say that we don't, and when officers say, well, I don't see color, well, that's false. We all see color, and so we talk through those things, and it's what we do, and we talk about how we have to look at each other and see how we're similar, because we are, and put ourselves in that same place. And I authored a book, 13 Days in Ferguson, and I always sign that book, I Am You. It doesn't matter who I signed it for, because I look at there are a lot of similarities that we are the same. And I just think from a law enforcement standpoint, we don't have that real honest conversation. And until we do in this country, we're going to be at this same point that we are now.
When you were interviewed about your leadership in Ferguson during the protests and the violence and the chaos there, you said that you did not tell people, don't let your emotions get too high, because you felt an internal conflict about wanting to preserve order. Of course, that's why you'd been brought in. But as an African-American man, knowing how transgressive these shootings were to the community at large, not just the community of color. I'm really interested in how you navigated that.
Well, I always say that, the middle road is the toughest part of the road, but I think that you have to be at that point. And I think you have to speak a truth. And so for me, of course, I'm wearing that uniform, and I understand what it stands for. I understand the men and women that on a daily basis do an outstanding job. But I also understand the struggles for people of color. And I think there was a truth there, and I think I had a responsibility to say that this is a truth, that the protesters that are out there are speaking a truth, and they deserve that right to speak. But I also think that we have to separate the two. And we have to treat the two different. And we kind of did that in Ferguson. Didn't start off that way, but we understand there's rioters and there's protesters. But we also have to understand that the people that are rioting, some people are for self-gain, but some people are rioting because of economics and not having food. We had people who would go into some of the stores and just fix themselves a hot dog and walk out. Still a theft, but that means there's hunger. Mm-hmm. So everybody that's looting, and I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do, but we have a lot of things in our country. People are starving and some of those things. And so I think it is a balance, but I think there has to be a truth, and I think that's what this country is saying when they watch the incident with Mr. Floyd. you have three people standing there that have to understand that that is not correct, and there must be an action that you must take. And it may not put you on the good side of your peers, because my action didn't put me on the good side of a lot of people in law enforcement that were participating in Ferguson and across this country. But that's the right thing to do, and that's what leaders must do.
Ronald Johnson is with us. If you've just gotten in on the show, he's now the CEO of Lodestone Solutions Group. He's a retired captain for the Missouri Highway Patrol, and he was brought in to manage the law enforcement response after Michael Brown was killed by a white police officer in Ferguson. Cami Chavis is with us, a former federal prosecutor, a professor of law, and director of the criminal justice program at Wake Forest University School of Law. And we turn often to Ronald Serpis. He's a former police chief and a professor of practice, criminology, and justice at Loyola University in New Orleans. I want to go right back to the phones here to Senna in Minneapolis. Senna, thanks so much for waiting. Much appreciated. What are you thinking as you listen to the discussion develop here?
Oh, my God. I guess my first thought is, at what point does any type of reconciliation happen involving the community? Where, when, and how can members of the community be involved in any type of process of reform? I don't care whether it involves unions or contracts or accountability. As far as I understand it, this is basically out of the public's hands, and I also know that if Derek, whoever his name is, hadn't put his knee in George Floyd's neck, that the third precinct wouldn't have burned. Like, I really don't, I see that as an A to B path. My concern is, like, where is the accountability to the actual public and to the actual community? I pay my taxes. I'm paying for these people to come around and basically, and I helped pay for this man to get killed. So where's the public accountability from the police as an institution? At what point does the role we play as funders get reflected in any type of say about the way that they're organized and the way they conduct themselves, and quite frankly, the way they think about people like me, who they will, let pay their checks and pay for their bullets, but still kill. So, like, I respect the intellect and the leadership of all the people speaking. I'm a pretty average Joe. I'm a pretty average Minneapolitan. I'm frustrated. I'm holding myself tight even in this moment just to try to control myself. But I guess I'm just kind of like, when, where, and how do they expect a cultural shift or any form of public accountability to occur? This dude doesn't even live in Minneapolis. Why is he here? What's his stake in this? What was ever his stake as an officer in this place and in this time? Why would he be in this city if this is not a place where he lives, where he doesn't have to be vulnerable to the scrutiny of doing his job improperly? He just ran away. All he had to do was go back home. What does he know about the people here? What does he even care? When does it stop just being a job for him?
Sen, I appreciate the perspective and the call. I want to hear from Eric in St. Paul. Hi, Eric.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing well, and I'm glad you called.
And I want to thank you guys for the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're part of it. Tell me what you're thinking.
Well, I have a history of, being involved in criminal justice and working with the public now and with police. And what I think is the biggest problem that has never been addressed is that, the police always and the system always talking about how, people don't tell and do all this stuff and, they can't get this done. But the police is almost like a gang. That's the systemic problem, is that they protect each other, and they won't tell on each other. They know who the bad ones are. Those good police know who the bad ones are, but they won't tell. That's the biggest problem from the top to the bottom. They know, and they won't tell on each other and put that out there and get those guys off the force.
Cami, Eric, hang on just 1 minute. Stay with us if you would. Cami, I hear you agreeing with that when Eric says they all know, but there's what we hear about the blue code of silence. That's true?
Exactly. Yes, that's what I was thinking. And this is, again, this has been documented, the code of silence, that blue code of silence, call it sometimes, that it persists in police departments. If you think about it, if you're out there, you're an officer, you're doing this dangerous job and the like, you want your buddies to protect you. And so if you do something that's improper and someone tells on you, goes to their superior, then you've got to think the next time that person's out there, is that person going to have their back? Are other officers going to have their back? And there have been a number of cases where people, putting rats in lockers and things like that, when good officers do the right thing and call out the misconduct or intervene when there's misconduct. And it's so important, when I said earlier that we have the tools, we can change the culture, we have to have the will to do it. We have to create a culture that makes it safe for others, that makes it impossible, where the officer with a knee on the neck is not protected by a wall of other officers looking on. He should be worried that something is going to happen to him. When I saw that, I didn't see a person who was concerned at all about the behavior.
Yes.
And that's what this blue wall of silence is.
That does seem apparent, doesn't it? Ron Serpis, I have to note, when you came in to run New Orleans, I mean, you were coming into a department that was rife with corruption and violence and acts of retaliation. So given what you've just heard Eric and Senna say, how does your experience apply, I guess, to what has to happen here?
I think we got to keep the fight up. We instituted policies in Nashville and New Orleans that automatically terminated police officers who lied and prevailed to the Tennessee Supreme Court and the Louisiana Supreme Court. We instituted policies that if you saw misconduct of another officer and you didn't report it, you would receive the exact same sanction. That gave officers a safe place, meaning they could blame it on policy that they were telling on their partner. And I have absolute total support for what Cammie just said and what Ron has said and what your callers have said. There are police departments where that protection mechanism is stronger than what's right, but there's also police departments where those protection mechanisms are being broken down, where if you do not report the misconduct or if you interfere with the misconduct investigation, you're terminated. The courts are supporting forward-leaning police chiefs, myself included, who put those policies in place. So I think it would be the ultimate good news if the culture changed and you didn't need those policies to give people room to stand to report misconduct. But until we can get there, those kind of policies help it. I've had police officers in all the departments I was chief report other officers for egregious misconduct. That's not the solution. Possibly it's a good sign, though.
Ron Johnson, what do you see in the reality? We have a bystander video. We haven't seen the body cam stuff yet. But what do you see in the fact that there are 3 other officers standing around and letting this occur?
Well, I think just like I think as Tammy said, that it's this culture of I don't want to be the one that says anything. Because what happens if I say anything and it doesn't go anywhere? Now I am impacted within my agency. I'm impacted by those officers that I work with every day. And that can't be the first thing that pops in your mind. There has to be a morality there and that moral compass that you have and a sense of humanity and that part of you that says it doesn't matter what anybody thinks about me. I have to do the right thing. And I have an obligation here. And it can't be about me. It can't be about my career. It can't be about me in any form or fashion. But that officer has to know that when he reports that those in leadership will have the proper response. And so I think sometimes we focus on the relationship between officer to officer, and sometimes that officer is concerned, what will leadership do? And if leadership has the right thing in place, and I think that's what the chief talked about from New Orleans, he had the right thing in place. And once you put the right thing in place, and officers know that the right system in place, that's how you can change a culture. So the tools are there. And so when we look at what's going on in Minnesota, and the young man earlier talked about how do we fix this? How do we start working on this relationship? Well, you start working on it right now in the midst of chaos. You know, if I had an opportunity to go to Minnesota today and consult with whether the mayor's office or that police chief, I would give them some things I've been kind of watching. You need to start that now, and that is not taking place now. It's kind of like we're going to fight now, and then we'll say we'll make up later, and that is not what's going to work, and that is not what's going to heal this. And we do find, like the young man said, the officer didn't live there, and how do you fix that? Well, every officer may not live in that community, but I've said if an officer doesn't live in there, part of his employment should be that he's mandated to have so many community service hours within that community that he works if he or she doesn't live there. But you've got to have a way to know your community. And so those are things that we must talk about and have a conversation about. And I would love to come to Minnesota and talk about those issues and bring those officers in and have some real conversations with them, because that's what it takes. And the answer really to change, it's with those protesters. If we listen to their voice and hear what they're saying, it will be impactful.
Abdi says on Twitter, community must trust their own leaders. But how can we describe a community? Who is a community? Who are the leaders? It seems we have multiple layers of systems and its own leaders and multiple layers of communities with no equal representation and rights. And Eric says, these aren't bad apples. They're exactly the apples chosen and cultivated by people like Bob Kroll, who is the head of the police union. And now they're reaping their harvest. It isn't the apples or the barrels, but the orchard that needs to be uprooted and replanted. And Rachel says, it starts with understanding why the city is burning and acknowledging it. If they can't understand that or call it senseless violence, then they aren't ready for meaningful change. This isn't senseless. This is all they have left. We're going to get a look at the latest news and come back with our conversation with our guests and more of your calls and questions. I'm listening to you this morning and asking you, as citizens of our wider community here, not just Minneapolis, beyond, members of law enforcement, people who are part of the criminal justice system, are you confident that mayors and police chiefs and other community leaders know the extent of the problem, know how to make the necessary changes inside police departments? That's what we're hearing this morning from all of our guests. Are you confident that can be done? 651-227-6000, wherever you are this morning, 800-242-2828. And on Twitter at Kerri MPR. Just a note here that Governor Walz is now going to hold his press conference at 10:30. So we'll continue our conversation through the 10 o'clock hour and then listen live to the governor. To John Wanamaker now. Hi, John.
Hi, Kerri. Protests over the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis police custody have spread to other cities across the United States. In New York City, protesters defied the city's coronavirus ban on public gatherings yesterday, clashing with police while demonstrators blocked traffic in downtown Denver and downtown Columbus. A day earlier, demonstrators had taken to the streets in Los Angeles and Memphis. Meanwhile, a Mississippi mayor whose remarks about Floyd's death sparked outrage is resisting calls to resign, including from his own town's Board of Aldermen. President Trump is threatening to take action to bring Minneapolis under control, calling violent protesters thugs. He tweeted today that, quote, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. That tweet drew another warning from Twitter, with the social media giant saying he had violated the Twitter rules about glorifying violence. The move came a day after Trump signed an executive order challenging the site's liability protections. Trump also tweeted about Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey yesterday, calling him, quote, the very weak radical left mayor. Frey had a fiery response to the president, saying weakness is refusing to take responsibility for your actions. U.S. consumer spending plunged by a record 13.6% in April as the COVID-19 pandemic shuttered businesses, forced millions of layoffs, and sent the economy into a recession. Last month's spending decline was far worse than the revised 6.9% drop in March, which itself had set a record for the steepest one-month fall in records dating back to 1959. Friday's Commerce Department figures reinforced evidence that the economy is gripped by the worst downturn in decades. Consumers unable to or too anxious to spend much. Consumer spending accounts for about 70% of economic activity. And looking to Wall Street, stocks now down across the board. The Dow Jones off by 174 points. This is NPR News.
I'm Angela Davis. It wasn't just the death of George Floyd while in police custody that led to this week's protests and riots. Anger has been building for decades. At 11, I'll dive into the historical context of this moment. How did we get here?
Programming is supported by Great River Energy, providing reliable electric service to 28 Minnesota member co-ops with a diverse mix of power generation, including power plants and renewable energy. Great River Energy, powering what's possible.
Now back to our conversation here with Ron Johnson, retired captain for the Missouri Highway Patrol. He's the author of 13 Days in Ferguson. Cami Chavis is with us, a former federal prosecutor and professor of law at Wake Forest University School of Law. And Ronald Serpis is with us, a former police chief and a professor of practice criminology and justice at Loyola University in New Orleans. Cami, I want to ask you about something that our county attorney, Mike Freeman, said yesterday in a press conference. He is an experienced county attorney. I just want to give you some background. He has handled some of these police brutality and police shooting deaths cases before. But he said something that has really angered the community about this. Listen.
I will say this, that video is graphic and horrific and terrible, and no person should do that. But my job in the end is to prove that he violated a criminal statute. And there is other evidence that does not support a criminal charge. We need to wade through all of that evidence and to come through with a meaningful determination, and we are doing that to the best of our ability.
Cami, I should say that I think people who have seen the video found what he said about the other evidence somewhat alarming. What should we understand about what he's doing? And then we'll talk about your call for an independent prosecutor.
Yes, my understanding of what he said, I heard that and I thought, well, really, what other evidence would that be? It's really, as a prosecutor, not your job to go out there and make those types of comments, particularly when you haven't evaluated all of the evidence. And that is what needs to happen. All of the evidence needs to be evaluated. But I can say that what we've all seen is pretty striking. So I heard that he said that was in the statement. I don't know if people are finding that credible. But at this point, a prosecutor in this situation, you want to have an opportunity to look at things. The officers, another issue here is that officers typically have rights that other average citizens don't have in these situations, in terms of being able to speak with their counsel and things like that. And these are things that sometimes delay arrests and prosecutions. But I would say that the clock is ticking. Evidence also disappears in situations like this. People's memories and the ability to get witness statements. There were a lot of other witnesses there at the scene. So these things, time is of the essence here.
Do you believe, you've argued that independent prosecutors should be brought in to restore accountability. Do you believe that that's necessary now, and that no matter what the county attorney decides here, he has the credibility to see this through?
Well, I think that certainly where there is a conflict of interest, and you think about this, prosecutors' offices work very closely a lot of times with the very police officers and departments,
right,
for which they're responsible, for prosecuting. So that is where the potential for a conflict of interest exists. I don't take the tact that there's necessarily a conflict of interest, and that a local prosecutor can't prosecute police officers. I will say that it is very difficult for that to happen and still have because of the history, and still have the credibility that the community wants and deserves. So for that reason, I believe that independent prosecutors can be very helpful in ensuring the fairness both of the prosecution and the fairness of looking at all of the evidence and the community. It's very important here because what we're seeing in the streets, what you're witnessing there, is a huge distrust.
Yes.
Tired, exhaustion. And so it's going to be very important that the credibility of those who are involved in this are not questioned. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that was lost through that statement.
Let me grab a call here from Ed in Brainerd, Minnesota. Hi, Ed. Appreciate you waiting. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Great discussion. And I wanted to offer kind of an outstate perspective, for lack of a better word. Okay. I'm in Brainerd, and I've handled a case in Crosby, a small town near here, that involved serious law enforcement misconduct of a different kind. My client was, he's white, as I am. He was not murdered on the street as Mr. Floyd was, but he was the mayor of that small town. The police chief and lieutenant were threatened by what he might do, both when he was campaigning for mayor and became mayor. He criticized their leadership rightly, and they basically fabricated a series of serious criminal charges against him, arranged a high-profile arrest, brought in lots of media. It was all over the papers. My client had to resign as being mayor. His business was wrecked. His reputation was trashed. We defended the cases. 3 different juries found him not guilty, acquitted him on 3 different charges. The other charges were dismissed. He was completely vindicated, but obviously he was still out of office. The damage to his reputation. We're now in a civil suit against the city and the former lieutenant in chief. They lied, they fabricated evidence, and there was no accountability. The city didn't hold them accountable. I even wrote the Attorney General, Mr. Ellison, who I supported. I wrote the state auditor. I wrote the Post Board. All of them just gave me bureaucratic responses. Too bad, so sad, nothing we can do.
Ed, if I might, your larger point is, it sounds like this isn't just a big city issue. Is that right?
It's a problem all over. It's magnified by race. It's magnified by racism hugely, but it's a problem all over. And state institutions need to take responsibility. Places like the Attorney General, State Officer, Peace Officer Standards and Training Board need to get some teeth, need to take this seriously, which they have not been doing up until now.
Okay. I appreciate the call and the benefit of your experience there. Ron, given what Ed just said, when you and Ron Johnson were talking about having the infrastructure to back up, breaking apart this code of silence, I mean, where does the buy-in from that have to come from? Where do you find that kind of support?
I think there's a couple of examples. In all 3 departments I was chief, a governor and 3 mayors hired me to reform their departments. You don't bring in somebody from the outside to keep the status quo.
Okay.
And we have arrested and successfully prosecuted hundreds of officers during my time as a chief. So it's not to say that it doesn't happen, and it's not to say that because it happened, it's a fantasy and the world's a better place. I do really appreciate Cammie's input, because the police officer in this kind of event is going to claim that they were acting under the rules of their employment. So the prosecution and the investigation, right? I oversaw the investigation of police misconduct that resulted in injury and death from 1990 to 2014 in 3 states. What you have to do in that investigation is ensure you don't trip up and make some foolish error that results in a crafty defense that will reverse the actions you want. So what's changed is when we would say 10 years ago, we need time to do this right, what's been good and bad versus today is today you have so many more pieces of evidence that you don't have any control over that are going to appear. Videos from grocery stores, videos from people sitting in their cars. So I think it actually helps us to move the process more quickly. And to Ron's point, I can't help but agree as much as I can humanly. Those 3 other cops watching this did not feel empowered, obviously, to interrupt the death of a human for fear of whatever that might have been, and that is crucially wrong. And to the caller's point, American policing, by and large, about 90% or more of American police departments are very small. Mm-hmm. We only have a handful of really big police departments in America. So I think your call is right, too. This type of misconduct occurs not just in the big cities. The big cities are the bigger major media markets. You can hear more about it. So basically, we have to continually, here's my question and I'll stop. I fired a police officer in Nashville for lying about being late. Civil service supported me. 2 levels of courts didn't. It was the state Supreme Court that finally said, hey, you're right. If somebody's lying about being late and they know the most they can get is a letter of reprimand, what else are they lying about? That was a breath-freeing moment for the Nashville police officers because in the 7 years I was chief, we fired maybe 3 or 4 people for lying because the other officers was like, well, I don't want to be around this liar either. So to Ron's point, we have to create these cultural changes through places where people can feel protected to do what it is they felt they should do until it becomes normal to do what they should do. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. You know, Ron Johnson, I think that we all as bystanders, right, and viewers of this video think, well, if I was one of those 3 police officers watching this happen, I would have stepped in. I mean, we want to believe that we would be empowered and have our moral compasses, right, set right in that moment. But I also want to understand why it is so apparently difficult for these officers to do that, to act in that way.
Well, I can tell you that I believe that those same officers were off duty, and they saw that in public. And we see that throughout our country. Citizens will see an action and step in, and we call them heroes. But our policemen don't do that because it's their livelihood. Mm-hmm. And policemen are thinking about their pay. They're thinking about promotion opportunities or assignments, and on and on and on. And so there has to be this culture that says it's okay to do that. You know, one thing that I said doing Ferguson is that the blue line on my pants doesn't mean that I can't stand up and say something is wrong with the profession that I love. Mm-hmm. And if I'm willing to be proud when that profession does something right and stand up and cheer, I have to be able to stand and say when it's wrong. And so that has to be a conversation. And like Ron said, we have more small police departments in our country. And we have to make sure that we have funding to provide that training. And so when we start looking at training, large departments have a greater chance to do that. Smaller departments don't have the funding, and a lot of times it goes by the wayside. So there has to be funding for that. And training to me is not watching a video. A lot of training that we give, it's video training. And then officers will look at their computer and participate, take a test. They could take it 100 times until they pass. Mm-hmm. Well, that is not the kind of training you need. And so we have to have that one-on-one training, see those reactions, see those feelings, those emotions, and we have to begin to do that. And so I think that we have a lot of officers, and like Ron said, they don't want to be by those bad apples, but they don't have an idea how to get rid of them either. And they're dependent on leadership to do that. And so in Ferguson, I told some of the protesters, you're really angry at the police officers that are standing here on the post, but your anger should be at us as leaders, because that's where the failure is.
Ron, do you agree with that?
Kerri, yeah, and I wanted to add one point, and I want to be clear about this because it's not a defensive point. I'm actually, I think, making a strong point. When you drive down the street in your car, Kerri, you don't get to pick which police officer pulls you over. That's why I think police have a far greater duty than even the U.S. attorneys who were found to be part of prosecutorial misconduct that reversed the Danziger trial findings, with the U.S. attorneys that were prosecutorial misconduct in the Senator Stevens case, or the news reporter that loses their job because they plagiarized, or the Journal of American Medical Association research 10 years ago that said of physicians who saw misconduct, only 1/3 of those who saw it reported it. My point simply is this. We recruit every profession on the planet from the population. But police, you don't get to pick them like you do Burger King and McDonald's, and I think police have to be held to a higher standard because of it.
On Twitter here, Guante says there are smart, good people in some positions of power right now, but that's just more evidence that we need fundamental changes to police's role in society. not small reforms, because even with smart, good people in some positions of power, the violence continues. Our conversation this morning continues through the 10 o'clock hour. Here's what we're doing. Our guests are continuing the discussion with us. We're going to continue to take your calls. And then at 10:30, we're going to go live to the governor, who is making his first remarks since calling out the National Guard. To get in on this conversation as a retired or current member of law enforcement, as a citizen of our community, I'd love to hear what you think about whether you can trust, whether you are confident that change can happen. 651-227-6000, 800-242-2828, and on Twitter at Kerri MPR. Our discussion goes on.
Support comes from Maplewood Toyota, serving our community for almost 40 years. Maplewood Toyota is open for all your essential vehicle needs, and they're committed to assisting in every way. Phone or schedule an appointment online at maplewoodtoyota.com.
Programming is supported by Twin Cities Siding Professionals, a Marvin Windows authorized replacement contractor, celebrating over 25 years of serving customers in the Twin Cities area. More at tcsidingprofessionals.com/MPR.
You're listening to MPR News, 91.1 KNOW, Minneapolis, St. Paul, 69 degrees. Little taste of September here. It's partly cloudy and crisp temperatures. Highs in the upper 60s, mostly clear overnight with lows in the upper 40s. On Saturday, still cool. We've got lots of sunshine. That should warm things up a bit. Highs in the upper 60s. Warmer on Sunday with highs in the mid-70s with sunny skies. And then the beginning of the week looks like we boomerang right back into the 80s. Warmer on Monday, highs around 80. We are in the upper 80s by Tuesday, with partly cloudy skies. So feels like September, and then it feels like August. 69 in the metro.
Live from NPR News, I'm Corva Coleman. Minneapolis experienced a third night of unrest as demonstrators protested the death of an unarmed black man who was in police custody. President Trump tweeted insults about Minneapolis leaders. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey had a fiery response.
Donald Trump knows nothing about the strength of Minneapolis. We are strong as hell. Is this a difficult time period? Yes, but you better be damn sure that we're going to get through this.
Meanwhile, Twitter has labeled a tweet by Trump and another tweet from the official White House account repeating Trump's words as objectionable. Twitter says the two tweets about Minneapolis break its rules about glorifying violence. Critics are appalled over the president's apparent call to shoot people who are looting. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden says Trump is calling for violence against Americans during a moment of pain for many. 7 people were shot, at least one critically last night, after a peaceful protest in Louisville, Kentucky turned violent. Demonstrators are enraged about the death of Breonna Taylor, a black woman shot and killed by police in her home after they went inside with a warrant but without knocking. From member station WFPL, Amana Elahi reports Taylor wasn't even a suspect.
The demonstration began in front of City Hall. Initially, police faced the crowds but didn't engage. But as tensions rose, early this morning, Louisville Metro Police confirmed the shootings. Earlier, protesters broke the hand off a large statue of King Louis XVI in front of Metro Hall, vandalized a police vehicle, and started a small fire. Police fired tear gas and rubber bullets. Taylor's death gained national attention after her family sued the police department late last month. Investigations into the incident by Louisville police and the FBI are ongoing. For NPR News, I'm Amina Elahi in Louisville.
In Illinois, some retail shops and restaurants will reopen today under certain limitations. But NPR's David Shaper reports many businesses in Chicago will stay closed until the middle of next week.
Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker says every region of the state has now met the criteria to move into Phase 3 of his reopening plan. That means restaurants can reopen for outdoor dining with tables spaced at least 6 feet apart. Hair and nail salons, barber shops, and other providers of personal care services can reopen, but masks will be required. And non-essential retailers can reopen to a limited number of customers at a time. Governor Pritzker.
But our goal is and always has been to keep people safe from this coronavirus while we restore more of our normal activities.
It'll be a few more days, though, before Chicagoans can enjoy those activities, as Mayor Lori Lightfoot is delaying the city's limited reopening until next week. David Shaper, NPR News, Chicago.
On Wall Street, the Dow was down about 1%. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the George Lucas Educational Foundation, creator of Edutopia, an online resource committed to offering inspiration and information about what works in K-12 education. More at edutopia.org.
For NPR News in the Twin Cities, I'm John Wanamaker. Governor Tim Walz this hour is expected to address ongoing violence in the Twin Cities. A third night of looting, vandalism, and fires has destroyed several businesses on the near-south side of Minneapolis and the Midway area of St. Paul. We plan to carry the governor's remarks live on NPR News and online on Facebook Live. Members of the Minnesota National Guard are on the ground in Minneapolis as fires continue to burn this morning. NPR News reporter Tim Nelson was on the scene of the fires at the High Lake Shopping Center on Lake Street this morning.
There was, on either side of the Midtown Global Market, buildings burst into flame this morning again. There's another fire up near Cedar Riverside now. So these fires just keep going. And I stood in front of the Family Dollar by the Midtown Market and watched it burn for almost 45 minutes before the fire department got there. So they're stretched very thin. They're working very hard trying to catch up with all that's going on here.
Nelson said many people were still walking or driving around looking at damage. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey says he made the decision to evacuate the 3rd Police Precinct to keep officers and the public safe. Rioters were videotaped breaking through a perimeter fence late last night and eventually setting fire to the building.
The symbolism of a building cannot outweigh the importance of life, of our officers, or the public. We could not risk serious injury to anyone. And we will continue to patrol the 3rd Precinct entirely.
More buildings were burned in that neighborhood last night. Police Chief Todd Axtell of St. Paul says his department will not tolerate people who are using civil unrest and peaceful protests as an opportunity to vandalize and steal from local business. There have been break-ins at businesses in Midway, Sunray, and in the Cathedral Hill neighborhoods, among others. The forecast for today, partly sunny skies, highs in the 60s. Partly cloudy tonight, lows in the 30s, north, mid to upper 40s in the south. Tomorrow should be sunny with highs in the 60s. This is NPR News.
Support comes from Livewire, a full-service live event production company offering audio, video, lighting, staging, and scenery for corporate events, meetings, concerts, and theatrical events of any size in Minnesota, North Dakota, and around the country. More at livewirenow.com.
Programming is supported by Science Museum of Minnesota, presenting OmniFest at Home, where you can watch dinosaurs alive, wild ocean, mummies, and more from the comfort of your own couch. Learn more at smm.org.
I'm Kerri Miller. This is NPR News, and we've continued a conversation that we started yesterday. At the end of the show, we started to talk about why this bad apple theory doesn't really fit for an incident like the one that ended in George Floyd's death. And we've been talking about that with our guests this morning, taking note of something that the attorney for the Floyd family wrote in an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday. He asks, is this an outlier or is this endemic? It starts to feel like genocide. You probably, if you were listening in yesterday, you also heard our professor Dwayne Loines suggest that it's in the very DNA of the origin of law enforcement to bring these biases into the way that enforcement happens. Listen to the way he put it yesterday.
So we have this system genetically in our system. We have these law enforcement departments that were not designed to protect and serve black bodies. They were designed to be aggressive toward them and brutalize them. So what we're seeing with Mr. Floyd is unfortunate and it's wrong. It is the norm. It is not the exception. It is an extreme variant of the rule, but it is the rule, unfortunately. And until we realize that, we're not going to do anything about it.
Now, we have three guests with us this morning who have a lot of law enforcement and prosecutorial experience. We're hearing from Ronald Serpis. He's a former police chief of New Orleans, and now he's a professor of practice criminology and justice at Loyola University. Ronald Johnson is with us. He's a retired captain for the Missouri Highway Patrol. He led the law enforcement response during the Ferguson protests. He wrote a book about it called 13 Days in Ferguson. And Cami Chavis is with us. She's a former federal prosecutor, and she's a professor of law at Wake Forest University School of Law, and she thinks a lot about police reform. And of course, we're hearing from you this morning. I'll get to as many calls as we can before we go live to the governor for his remarks at about 10:30. 651-227-6000, 800-242-2828, and on Twitter at Kerri MPR. I want to go right to Alan in Minneapolis. Alan, I know you've waited for a really long time, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. Now, what do you want to add to the discussion?
Well, thank you for taking my call.
Of course.
And thank you for this discussion. I'm a 55-year-old person of color. I'm African-American. And I want to share with you, your listeners, the reason why these young folks are destroying everything and protesting is because when they go the legal route and file complaints, the city's civil rights department cover up for the officers.
Mm-hmm.
The internal affairs, it's like they're very aggressive, and you actually you feel intimidated when you go in there. I had in 2014, I was choked unconscious by the city. I have no criminal record. Out of Minneapolis police. I filed a federal lawsuit. And it's not just the police. The judge said because I was accused of a crime, the police had immunity. He used an illegal hold. The judge threw my case out and gave them a $5,000 judgment against me before it went to trial. It's not just the police. We don't condone this violence, but these folks have no other outlet. Their voices are not heard.
I think I hear you saying this is distrust of the criminal justice system as a whole. Cami, that's not the first time you've heard that, I'm sure.
No, and it's interesting because what Alan has said, and then the professor that you played from yesterday, I think when we think about the role of police officers, they are only invested with the power that they're given, right? So when I think about the fact that we're talking and having this discussion today because someone called the police about forgery, right? And then we go back to Eric Garner and we think about loose cigarettes. So there's something going on with our substantive criminal law. Like, do we need police officers in certain situations, but there are many, many situations now where folks call the police and the police have the authority, and any encounter between police and citizens can be deadly for either one. So I think we really need to think hard about the role of police and about the role of our criminal justice system, and why is it that the first thing we think about is, it's these little quality of life crimes, selling loose cigarettes on a street or those types of things. Why on earth do we have a person with a badge and a gun and the ability to use force to restrain someone in that situation? It's a really good question.
I'm so glad you brought this up because, Ron Johnson, I think we are asking ourselves in this community about proportionality. And we've seen this before here, and we've seen this in other communities. I don't understand what happens to that sense of proportionality. Do you?
You know, I always talk about justice, and our justice system can be based on wealth, and I think that's what the gentleman's talking about. We have a justice system sometimes, and it's the whole system, and I think that's what Cammie's talking about. It's just not police, it's the whole system that has this distrust, but our justice system can be based on wealth. And I always talk about when I've talked to the prosecutors is that if I go in for a case and I'm poor, and I have an attorney who does it and may not know some of the case law, so they don't present it. And someone with wealth has done the same thing, and they have a high-priced attorney.
Mm-hmm.
But they go in first, and their attorney makes a case and says, well, this is why that this should not be charged. The judge says, okay. Well, when that next guy comes in, just because this attorney doesn't bring it up, the case, and you know that it is the same thing, justice has to be some equality there. And I think that's what our protesters are saying. There is no equality and justice here. And so I think that has to change. And I think the gentleman talked about how do we create change. Our protesters are going to create change. There will be some change, but it has to be sustained. It can't just be for the moment to stop the yelling, the crying, and the pain. It has to be sustained. But what happens is we do it for a moment, and then it goes away in 2 or 3 years, and we're back to square one. And we've gone through that for the last 400 years. We've always put a Band-Aid on it. And we have to go ahead and let this system heal and be strong.
Yeah, Ron Serpis, I mean, that other question about that Cammie brought up about responding to trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill, or as she noted in the Eric Garner case, trying to sell cigarettes. I mean, that's what I'm asking when I talk about this proportionality. It is so confusing. What kind of insight can you?
And guess what? It's confusing to the officers as well. So in this COVID time, we have witnessed some survey data from the Police Chiefs Association that police departments, we can probably generalize, have stopped responding to about 20% of the call demand because of COVID. I think this is a great opportunity for us to consider, well, what were those 20% that they didn't respond to? Maybe those weren't police matters to begin with.
Yeah.
And that's the issue that a lot of forward-leaning reform police chiefs have been doing, law enforcement leaders I'm very proud to be part of. We have been arguing for several years now, since 2015, if you think it's confusing to the community why the police are enforcing laws passed by the community, the police are confused too. We send police officers to mental health calls. They have no mental health training. They have no mental health responses. They have no mental health tools. We send police officers to do the things that the government that's contracted in the 40 years I've been studying government and part of it. The government contracts its resource base. They can't get rid of police because it's politically not tenable, but they shift so much work on the backs of police. Here's a good one for you. We just did a lot of work in Ramsey County about fines and fees. I was part of a team that was very, we think, helpful with Ramsey, and here was the question I raised. When a judge issues a warrant for someone who didn't pay a fine or fee and the police officer serves the warrant because it's a legal instruction, the community is mad at the police officer. It further separates that relationship. So to sum that whole point up, the police are just as confused about all the laws they're being told to enforce by the political class as much as those who are being ruled by the political class are confused about the laws.
But by the way, so what is the answer when the judge issues a warrant for somebody who didn't pay a fee? And as you say, the instruction is that the police department, is supposed to go out there and serve that warrant and bring the person in. The good news is what?
Well, what's worse is the police officer will probably run across that person while they're at some event that has nothing to do with what the warrant was for. The officers will be compelled when they see the warrant, if that's what the law requires for them in that state, to arrest that person. They're dragged away from their family because of that. The solution is what Ramsey County just did, and Commissioner Tony Carter, the lead of the commission there, what they did is they said, well, we're just going to stop issuing these fines and fees for things that we can control at the county level, thus resulting in less of those kinds of warrants, that less of a disruption, and more importantly, get the cops out of the business of being bill collectors. I mean, the officers don't want to do that any more than the person who's having it done to them. So hats off to Ramsey County. Hats off to them looking at this in a way like San Francisco has recently done, like Dallas County's looking at, like Nashville-Davidson County, like Alameda County, that these fines and fees are putting police in positions that are not positive for the relationship, and they're putting people disadvantaged who don't want to pay if that they can't pay.
Call here from Ellie in Rochester. Ellie, it sounds like you spent quite a bit of time in law enforcement. Is that right?
Yes, I retired 3 years ago, 25 years as a police lieutenant in Rochester, Minnesota.
I'm really glad you called, and I'm curious about how you're hearing this discussion continue.
I find it interesting, obviously, on so many levels, and I feel a little bit privileged as former law enforcement to be occupying so much of the station time on this broadcast. But I don't want to make this about myself, but one of the things that's really important to add credibility to what you'll hear, which for me will be a quite different take of what you've heard from many of the others so far, is 3 years ago, I was recommended to be terminated from the Rochester Police Department by our chief because I made a report of potential bias that was potentially being held against one of my Puerto Rican officers who was up for higher classification work, and he kept getting denied. I was put on paid leave for that, and ultimately it's illegal to fire someone for reporting bias, so I ended up with $1 million settlement from the city of Rochester.
Wow.
Ending my policing career earlier than I wanted, but nonetheless, it's over. So I have a unique experience as to what it's like from a police officer's perspective, even in a position of command staff that I was in at the time, when you do speak up to injustice within a police department, particularly when it comes to potential racial injustice, the fallout that can happen. Now, I was close enough to retirement at 50 at the time that I was eligible for a pension in addition to the settlement amount. But if someone has a family, say you have a 30-year-old female officer who's a single mom and she has 3 kids, and she's witnessing things on her department that would clearly strike her as bias or inappropriate policing, that officer, especially based on what happened to me and in the city of Rochester, if I could get fired for this, that officer can't risk the only paycheck that they have to support their family. I'm not saying that's right.
No, you're saying that
that's reality.
You really aren't incentivized. You really are not incentivized to come forward with the kinds of information that leadership should want to know.
Not incentivized, and then you're vilified as well. And if police, I'm really annoyed by the bad apple scenario. It's such an old take on an old issue. But if they do want to use that, and I've heard it over and over again, then this isn't a case of just a bad apple. If that was the case, police departments throughout the state are represented by police unions that represent each of their officers on their department. If this really was an outlying case of officers behaving badly in the most horrific way that caused the death of Mr. Floyd, it doesn't take a full investigation by the union to see and to issue a statement that says, well, we recognize that the death...
Oh, Ellie, I think we lost your line. Cammie, I think we've got the essence of what she was saying there. What do you make of her argument?
Yes, I think, again, it seemed like, to me, she was going to say, the police unions, right, it doesn't take a full investigation to say, we've seen, enough evidence to be troubled by this, and let that be it. They're going to go ahead and protect the officer, but sometimes those comments that come out are just even more damaging. But I think that her earlier comments about the retaliation that you face, we discussed that a little bit earlier, but it's a real impediment to when you want to have officers who want to do the right thing, and the reality is that they've got a mortgage to pay and children to take care of. So I really think that looking at, and I was glad when Ron is mentioning these concrete examples of what
other jurisdictions have done. So these policies that have, protected what we call, whistleblowers, but really they're not whistleblowers. They're people who are doing the right thing. And I believe that Ron mentioned Nashville and New Orleans and the police departments have policies like that. But also just again, we have jurisdictions and things that we can look to. We are not hamstringed by a lack of knowledge or a lack of, we know what to do. We just have to do it.
Ron Johnson, I was taking note of something the St. Paul Police Chief Todd Exdell said upon seeing the video. Now, this was, I think, hours before some of the violence carried over into St. Paul. But he said something like, if his officers saw that video and they believed that officers and the officers in the video acted appropriately, then they should reconsider their career choice. It was a very definitive, firm kind of statement. But when I saw it, I thought, I'm not confident that officers will look within themselves and be honest enough to, to put themselves out of a job. I guess it made a lot of sense to say it. I'm not sure that the rank and file would feel empowered or even the necessity to really take stock of it. Do you know what I'm asking?
I know exactly what you're asking, and I totally agree. And so I think that's an easy statement to make. I think that you make that statement believing that people will get immediate buy-in. It's okay.
Yeah.
But officers won't. I think the officer that spoke a minute ago,
Ellie?
I think she really defined where we are when she talks about if you speak up and what happens and what could happen. I think Cammie talked about the things are there, and what Ron talked about, the things are there. We just have to use those. But I spoke yesterday on a news interview here for the local station, and that's what I told them. I said, the part that bothers me the most is that there'll be people that will see that video, officers and even citizens in our country, and we'll see nothing wrong with that.
Wow, really? That's
yes.
That's confusing. Why?
Well, there'll be officers that won't see anything wrong, and I think some of it is because of culture, because of this qualified immunity that law enforcement have. I wasn't there, I wasn't, and they'll come up with a lot of reasons. And I think what she talked about, this bad apple barrel thing, I think that is an old conversation. That is an easy way out. And so I don't even have that conversation. That this is just one bad apple in the barrel. When we really start digging deep into law enforcement agencies that get involved in this, we see that this isn't the first case. When we have officers who've had 18 or 19 complaints,
yeah,
we can't just say that these are just bad apples.
Ron Serpis, what would you say?
I think we have the situation that she described, and what Ron just said is that so look at it this way. So all the years I was a chief, you had a very small number of officers were involved in inward discipline, meaning a supervisor wrote them up for outward discipline, a citizen complained. And it was generally only a handful of people constantly repeating. And then you got to look at why the system allows them to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you think about the unions are a political enterprise. And what drives unions, and I've worked with probably 30 of them now in policing, what drives union is the chronic voter, just like a mayor's race is driven by chronic voters. And the chronic voter in the police union is aging out, and that chronic voter is the one that thinks the police can do no wrong. I'm a detective. You have to protect me at all costs. I breathed longer than this guy or lady, so you have to protect me at all costs. And what the unions are confronting right now, which could be a harbinger of, could be a window of good news, the younger generations are not as willing to put up with that kind of thinking either. Right? So we have a generation coming into the workforce that wants to be the chief 6 weeks after they start. When they get into a union environment where they tell them you have to breathe 55 years before you're able to get a new job, if we don't alter those, again, back to structure, if we don't alter those structures and those relationships, both entities are going to wither on the vine. The police are not going to be able to recruit and retain, and the unions are not going to be able to recruit and retain. So again, maybe this is an opportunity to kind of reset that reset that balance. And final thought, when I returned to New Orleans in the summer of 2010, that's when we began having the federal trials on the Danziger misconduct, on the Glover misconduct. And I saw a bit of a change. Officers who were willing to think that we lived through Katrina, people don't understand this, and this was a terrible thing.
Right.
When those trials played out publicly and those officers saw what those other officers did, you know what was the most common refrain would be told to me?
What?
Chief, I was in water up to my shoulders for a week trying to help people get out of buildings. All of my work is now on the ash heap of history because of what those people did in uniform, I saw a subtle shift.
So
and
all
I bet
that...
you a lot of Minneapolis police officers were saying, this guy Chauvin doesn't represent me. Callously with his hand in his pocket. There's no resisting of arrest going on there. So hopefully, while I think Ron's probably more right than I am an optimistic person. There's going to be some Minneapolis police officers that say, that's not me and that's not what I'm about.
I mean, Ron, I hear you saying that this feeling that the work, the commitment to service that so many law enforcement people feel gets tainted every time
absolutely
by these acts. Now what I think what you're all saying is now we have to double down on that feeling of they're betraying my own commitment to service and be willing to call it out within the ranks.
Yes.
Is that right?
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. That when immediately when I saw, Derek Chauvin's knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, I thought that your other officers, even the ones standing there, again, we said, they're standing there callously, but at some point, you have tarnished the image of that entire department. As Ron was saying earlier, it's usually a very small percentage of officers that have the most complaints. So, knowing that, but then when we see these images and then when you hear the names and you call the names, too long to state, Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, Thurman Blevins, and you have that history, it is a very difficult conversation then to bring a community to the table and have the trust.
From Mike on Twitter, the apples don't pick themselves. We have the apples that were cultivated and picked. The grower and the picker have chosen the apples to grow and have selected the apples to be used. Also from Farney B., I live 4 blocks from the 3rd precinct. I'm a white man. I don't trust the Minneapolis Police Department. If they've lost me, who the system was designed to protect, they have lost the city. They need to be removed wholly and start over from scratch. I want to let you know what we're doing here. Yes, we've continued into the 10 o'clock hour. We're awaiting remarks from Governor Walz, who called out the National Guard to assist in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and we're going to go live to the governor. Ronald, Tammy, Ron, thank you.
The most difficult week in Minnesota in recent history and maybe in our entire history. Our community, especially our Black community, is hurting beyond words. Minneapolis and St. Paul are on fire. The fire is still smoldering our streets. The ashes are symbolic of decades and generations of pain, of anguish, unheard. Much like we failed to hear George Floyd as he pleaded for his life as the world watched, by people sworn to protect him, his community, our state. Philando Castile, silenced, unheard. So many other friends, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, senselessly died in our street. Their voices went unheard, and now generations of pain is manifesting itself in front of the world. And the world is watching. One of the first people I called after seeing the video was Valerie Castillo, Philando's mother. We've become friends since the killing of Philando. And for those watching today who aren't familiar, Philando died in front of his loved one and his child, and left them behind and left behind a grieving mother who has become an advocate for justice, an advocate for reform, but more importantly, an advocate for kindness and decency. And when I talked to Valerie, she said first and foremost, seek justice, seek fairness, and reach out and show kindness. What the world saw last night was not that. What the world has witnessed since the killing of George Floyd on Monday has been a visceral pain, a community trying to understand who we are and where we go from here. I'm joined today by Attorney General Ellison, by Major General John Jensen, the Adjutant General of the Minnesota National Guard, Colonel Langer of the Minnesota State Patrol, and Commissioner John Harrington. I spoke this morning with Reverend Jackson, who, much like Valerie, said a prayer for our state, said a prayer for over those grieving, said a prayer for peace, and then also said something very important. This is the moment where we start, but every time we get to this place, we never start the process to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that commitment amongst leaders in our community, watching this happen across the United States, watching another name be added, and for those of us who are old enough, to Rodney King, to Mike Brown, and unfortunately now we've added George Floyd. The situation on the ground doesn't allow us at this time to tackle those issues. The very assets in our community, our libraries, our businesses, those nonprofits and government entities, our light rail system, are all shut down from this. We have to restore order to our society before we can start addressing the issues. Before we turn back to where we should be spending our energy, making sure that justice is served swiftly, and that we learn something from what George Floyd gave on Monday. Now I want to just be very clear, and I'm going to have the team talk about what transitioned last night when the state assumed responsibility over the security near the 3rd precinct, where the state secured critical assets, and where the plan going forward to ensure that tonight our buildings do not burn, our citizens are secure, and that space that we're going to create allows us to get back to the conversation of serving justice and making sure that we're not adding to that list of unheard names. And I want to be very clear and speak to that community. The very tools that we need to use to get control, to make sure that buildings aren't burned and the rule of law collapses, are those very institutional tools that have led to that grief and pain. I understand clearly there is no trust in many of our communities. And the differentiation between the Minneapolis Police Department that we witnessed losing trust of those they're there to serve is very difficult for people to make, for those standing up here with me. I understand that. And I will not patronize you as a white man without living those lived experiences of how very difficult that is. But I'm asking you to help us. Help us use humane way to get the streets to a place where we can restore the justice, so that those that are expressing rage and anger and demanding justice are heard, not those who throw firebombs into businesses that our communities of colors have worked so hard to build back up areas that were blighted at one time and are thriving because of their entrepreneurship and their hard work. A library in an area where our children, as we know, are institutionally put behind, and the achievement gap for our communities of color is a shame on this state that we continue to admire by talking about and don't repair it. And that tool to help with that burned last night. So I want to just call out very, very clearly, as we put a presence on the street to restore order, it is to open that space to seek justice and heal what happened. I will not in any way not acknowledge that there's going to be that pain, but my first and foremost responsibility to the state of Minnesota is the safety and security of all citizens. We cannot have the looting and the recklessness that went on We cannot have it because we can't function as a society, and I refuse to have it take away the attention of the stain that we need to be working on is what happened with those fundamental institutional racism that allows a man to be held down in broad daylight, and thank God a young person had a camera to video it, because there's not a person here or listening today that wonders how many times that camera's not there. These are tough questions. These are things that have been brewing in this country for 400 years. We have people out there putting themselves on the line to try and put out fires in our firefighters that are under attack. Those are the things I'm asking you. Help me restore that order. We will do that under state leadership and state guidance. You will hear directly from them of once that decision was made around 12:15 last night, and that first mission was executed around 3:45 at the 3rd precinct, we will see a difference. So I'm asking you, and you'll hear from them, to talk about this. I also want to think about what happens when we don't have that. People who are concerned about that police presence of an overly armed camp in their neighborhoods that is not seen in communities where children of people who look like me run to the police, others have to run from. So I understand that that's out there. But last night I got a call from a friend and a dedicated public servant. Senator Torres Ray called in her district, and it was on fire. And there weren't any police there. There weren't any firefighters. There was no social control, and her constituents were locked in their house wondering what they were going to do. That is an abject failure that cannot happen. We must restore that order to that. Senator Torres Ray has fought her whole life on these issues of inequities and making sure that people's voices are lifted up. But what she understands is none of us can lift those voices. None of us can tackle these problems if anarchy reigns on the street. I also want to address an issue, and this one is on me, and I will own it. Earlier this morning, when this mission was carried out under my direction to resecure the 3rd precinct, to do so in a manner which I am proud of how it was executed by this team, no injuries and no loss of life, a reestablishment to put the fires out for those businesses. A CNN reporter a crew was arrested by the State Patrol. A few minutes after hearing that, I was on a call with CNN President Jeff Zucker, who demanded to know what happened. I take full responsibility. There is absolutely no reason something like this should happen. Calls were made immediately. This is a very public apology to that team. It should not happen. And I want to be clear for those of you listening. I think our Minnesota's reporters know this. I am a teacher by trade, and I have spent my time as governor highlighting the need to be as transparent as possible and have the press here. I failed you last night in that. And it does not escape me that we are here on the catalyst that lit this spark by what happened with a police detainment of George Floyd, and the idea that a reporter would have been taken while another police action was in play is inexcusable. So to CNN, to the CNN team, to the journalists here, this is about having a plan, and that's what these folks are going to talk about. This is about having an aggressive approach to understanding what the community needs, to not coming in heavy-handed with them, but to create space where the story can be told. In a situation like this, even if you're clearing an area, we have got to ensure that there is a safe spot for journalism to tell the story. The issue here is trust. The community that's down there that's terrorized by this, if they see a reporter being arrested, their assumption is because something's going to happen that they don't want to be seen. And so that is unacceptable. We will continue to strive to make sure that that accessibility is maintained, that not only that, the protection and security and safety of the journalists covering this is a top priority, not because it's a nice thing to do, because it is a key component of how we fix this. Sunshine, disinfectant, and seeing what's happening has to be done. So again, I appreciate President Zucker's call. I appreciate his understanding in a situation that he was rightfully incredibly angry, and that falls squarely on me. That apology has been issued, and I think going forward to make sure it doesn't happen again. It's time for us to clean our streets. It's time for us to execute today in a way that shows respect and dignity to communities. I'm going to ask for a lot of help today of those folks who want to see it. It is my expectation that justice for the officers involved in this will be swift, that it will come in a timely manner, that it will be fair. That is what we've asked for. I have been in contact with Hennepin County Attorney, and I am confident that those very things I just said will happen. We will continue at the BCA to do a fair, a full, and a swift gathering of all of the evidence involved. But I would reiterate again, for so many of us, not all that's done in every other case where all of that evidence is gathered before, and I would ask that the swift justice be carried out. So Minnesotans, your pain is real. The chapter that's been written this week is one of our darkest chapters, and we can choose a few things. We can choose to try and get past this. We can choose to put a force out there and stop things from happening. We can hope that in the midst of COVID-19 or something else, it passes by and we don't have to turn that mirror to look at the harsh reality of those underlying gaps, whether it be healthcare disparities, whether it be educational disparities in our communities of color, whether it be policing disparities in our community of color, whether it be wealth acquisition in our communities of color, are all very real. We pride ourselves on a state of openness. We pride ourselves on a state of being friendly. I've talked a lot about One Minnesota. That wasn't on display last night. I don't naively think everything heals and you come to the forefront and you say it'll be better. This is a community that demands and should expect more than words. They should expect results. Lieutenant Governor Flanagan and I have tried to make equity the center of everything we've done. But obviously in Minneapolis on Monday night, there wasn't a lot of equity for George Floyd. His family is probably wondering where the One Minnesota is for them. And that's on us as Minnesotans, us as the governor and the team that works with me, to put the things in order to establish order in our streets, to establish and rebuild trust in our communities, to lift those voices up to be heard, not pleading for their lives, but demanding the changes necessary so no one else is put into that position. So I would like at this time to turn it over to Minnesota's Attorney General, Keith Ellison.